Welcoming everyone tonight to this meeting on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism and the left. And we are very pleased to have with us Brian Klug, who is Professor of Philosophy at St Benet's Hall, University of Oxford. His books, which one of which is at the front here, another which he was co-editor of, which he says is probably the most important for people at this meeting, and we've got plenty of copies of that in bookmarks, which is Independent Jewish Voices on Israel, Zionism and Jewish Identity, which I can highly recommend. Brian has also written an important book called Offence, the Jewish Case, and he's also contributed many articles on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. In The Guardian, no, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I think you probably gathered that. The Myth of the New Anti-Semitism in the Nation, and Anti-Semitism the Left, published in Red Pepper. He's Associate Editor of Patterns of Prejudice and on the advisory boards of Islamophobia Studies Yearbook and Reorient the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies. So Brian will speak first for 20 minutes. He's warned us he's going to race through, so pay attention, concentrate, because we do want to limit it for 20 minutes, because we also have two other speakers and obviously your good selves. So over to Brian.
Thank you very much. The clock is ticking, so I will jump straight into this. Frankly, I don't know how to approach this talk. There are a number of things that I want to say which are difficult to get across at this forum, and 20 minutes doesn't give me much time to do it. Mainly, I'm going to be critiquing the stock way in which Zionism is thought about and spoken about on the pro-Palestinian left. And I'm referring to a discourse that folds Zionism completely, without remainder, into the history of European imperialism and colonialism.
So sorry.
Is that better?
I think it's a bit closer.
A little closer? How's that? Okay. As if Zionism does not have its roots in the Jewish experience.
I hope that this will be added to the...
Yes, it'll be added to your time.
Is that better? How am I doing? Okay. All right. So I'm going to be critiquing what I see as a problem with the standard discourse about Zionism, which doesn't...
It needs to go on.
Well, I prefer to stand because I can protect my voice better, but I tell you what, if it doesn't work, that's it. Thank you. Well done. Well done. Interesting. Thank you. I was beginning to think that I was the victim of anti-Semitism here. So. You'd be surprised, microphones can be very bigoted. Anyway, as I say, I want to make a criticism of the standard way in which Zionism is spoken about as if it doesn't have roots in the Jewish experience of centuries of exclusion and persecution in Europe. I want to argue that not only is this view of Zionism warped, but it pours oil onto the troubled waters of the topic we're here to discuss. To many people in this room, my critique, taken with other things I say, is liable to sound like a defense of Zionism, especially if you don't know me, and it's not. And there's my difficulty, how to give my critique in such a way that you can hear it, and how to get you to hear my voice, not the voice of someone else, as it were, speaking through my mouth, someone with a different agenda from mine. So let me start out by stating what my agenda is. I'm seeking a change in the way in which Zionism is spoken about on the left, and I'm also calling for a more thoughtful response when the question of anti-Semitism is raised. I'm not seeking to change anyone's mind politically. Politically, I assume that on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, most of us here in this room are on the same page, more or less. But in case there's any doubt about this, let me make it clear where I stand. From where I stand, the very phrase, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is misleading. It gives the impression of two equal parties competing with each other, like Arsenal playing Bayern Munich. That's a joke, by the way. But with Palestine and Israel, the parties are not remotely equal, and the name of the game isn't football. It's injustice. There is, on the one hand, a dispossessed people, the Palestinians, and on the other hand, a state, Israel, which has oppressed this people ever since the state came into existence in 1948. Nearly 70 years later, this takes the form of occupation, siege, structural discrimination, and cultural racism. Zionism is the movement that led to the creation of the state. Successive Israeli governments lay claim to the mantle of Zionism. In its name, they have pursued an expansionist project. Earlier this year, Tzipi Hotovely, a member of the right-wing Likud party and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, expressed her support for building more Jewish settlements on the West Bank. She said, I quote, "The current Israeli government was elected to act on the Jewish people's right to build in all parts of our land, and we must respect the will of the people who elected us for this purpose." Well, funny, I'm part of the Jewish people, but I don't remember electing the current Israeli government, nor even having a vote, nor do I accept for one moment that it is our land. Nor am I alone in this. Innumerable other Jews all over the world think as I do. Yet the Israeli government claims to speak for us all. Thus, Zionism, certainly the Zionism that is dominant today, makes a claim over two peoples, the Palestinians, whom it dispossesses, and the Jews, whom it thinks it possesses. All Jews, whoever they are, wherever they live, including me. These claims are two sides of one coin. I reject both claims. I reject the coin. So I've told you my agenda and I've told you where I stand politically. Please try to keep both things in mind as I turn to the topic of our session, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the left today. Now, the mere mention of these words, I think of what happened after Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party in September 2015. A spate of accusations were made against people on the left, including several Labour Party officials. Lurid headlines seemed to vie with each other in ratcheting up the charges. One in the Israeli daily Haaretz read, "Why Britain's Labour Party has suddenly become synonymous with anti-Semitism." Synonymous, as if the Labour Party might as well change its name to the Anti-Semitism Party. 3 days earlier, The Telegraph published an opinion piece with the title, "The Left's Hatred of Jews Chills Me to the Bone." The author, Stephen Pollard, editor of the Jewish Chronicle, claimed that, and I quote him, "The Labour Party is now run by a cadre for whom anti-Semitism really is okay so long as it is dressed up as anti-Zionism." Well, whatever else, Pollard cannot be accused of British understatement. That, by the way, is British understatement. Whether or not any of the allegations of anti-Semitism were true, there was clearly a pincer movement, a cynical campaign waged by enemies of Labour on the outside and enemies of Jeremy within. One individual after another was named and shamed, tried in the kangaroo court of public opinion, often on the basis of comments that were taken out of context. This naming and shaming was itself shameful. That's how it struck me at the time, and it still does, especially because it was done in the name of combating anti-Semitism. And yet, things are not quite that simple. Let me tell you about an experience that a friend of mine has just told me about. I'll call her Daphne, not her real name. Daphne is a lifelong socialist and a Jewish anti-Zionist, fiercely opposed to Israel's occupation of the West Bank. She's also a member of the Labour Party. And at a well-attended CLP meeting a few weeks ago, she proposed a motion criticizing Ken Livingstone for the remarks he made linking Nazism and Zionism. Daphne's view was that Ken, in her own words, should not have invoked the name of Hitler as he did. She put it to me this way, quote, "The history of the Holocaust is part of the identity of all Jews, whatever they may feel about Israel." Now, I don't want to open up the can of worms over whether Ken should or should not have said what he said. It's neither here nor there for my purpose in telling this anecdote. Whatever you think of the position Daphne took, the point is this: it had nothing to do with Ken's views on Israel, and she made this clear when she proposed the motion. Nevertheless, and I quote her, "Everyone who spoke against the motion suggested that it was part of a plot by Israel, or that it was an attempt to prevent discussion of Israel." Daphne was made to feel, in her own words, an agent of the Israeli state. Her opponents didn't address her arguments. They didn't try to defend what he said, Daphne told me. They were, quote, "only interested in discrediting those behind the motion by linking it to Israel or right-wing maneuvering in the party." In effect, her opponents, quote, "shut down discussion. I felt I was being silenced," she said. Now, I shall pick up just 2 points from Daphne's story. First, the fact that her opponents shut down discussion. How ironic. We are familiar with situations in which critical discussion of Israel is shut down by people crying anti-Semitism. In Daphne's case, however, discussion of an issue that deeply affects many Jews, regardless of their views about Israel, was shut down by people in effect crying Zionism. What should we call this? Words like mindless and manipulative come to mind, just as they do when the boot is on the other foot, when pro-Israel zealots shut down discussion. But is there more to it than that? Maybe not, but it's a fair question. Second, here we have an anti-Zionist, anti-occupation Jew being made to feel by a group of people on the left, all of whom knew her, as though she were an agent of the Israeli state. Again, how ironic. And again, what should we call this? Anti-Semitism? Or maybe, I don't know, and I almost said I don't care. The word anti-Semitism is so contested and so emotive that it sometimes seems to get in the way of thinking. And I don't want to talk about labels, I want to talk about the thing itself, the ugliness of the way that Daphne's opponents behaved. Ugly partly because of the injustice involved, the injustice to her, just like the injustice when it's the other way around, when people of goodwill who denounce Israel are made to feel as though they were anti-Jewish when they are not. So again, what should we call the way Daphne was treated? Well, I refrain, as I say, from crying anti-Semitism, but it's not hard to see why someone with a pro-Israel, without a pro-Israel agenda, might genuinely suspect that bigotry plays a role, even if it is, shall we say, inadvertent. Racism, like a dream, often dwells somewhere beneath the surface of the conscious mind. Now, I invite you to ponder these reflections, these complexities, and not to dismiss them out of hand. All too often, when a Jewish person, even an anti-Zionist, anti-occupation Jew, says they feel uncomfortable or worse with the way in which Jews or Israel are spoken about, the knee-jerk reaction is to scoff and to cry Zionism. We wouldn't treat members of other racialized minorities this way, then why the Jews? On that provocative note, let me turn at last to the main item on my agenda, critiquing the standard way in which Zionism is thought about and spoken about on the pro-Palestinian left. In a nutshell, Zionism is seen as part and parcel of the history of European, especially British, imperialism, and Israel as a settler colonial state, to which I have two responses. Yes, that's true, and no, that's false. It's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough, and what it leaves out is crucial, which is why it's false. Now let me try to elucidate, and as I do so, please try to remember that I'm seeking neither to defend Zionism as a political movement or idea, nor to justify oppression of the Palestinians by the State of Israel. That oppression is unjustifiable. But that doesn't justify misconstruing the origins of Zionism and what it has meant for many Jews in the past and what Israel continues to represent, however mistakenly, for many ordinary Jews today, including many Jews who don't identify as Zionist. These misinterpretations, moreover, do nothing to advance the Palestinian cause or, more broadly, the prospects of peace based on justice for the whole population of Palestine and Israel. Allow me to introduce you to Aurora Levins Morales. Aurora is a Puerto Rican Ashkenazi Jewish feminist writer and a member of Jews of Color in Solidarity with Palestine. She's also a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, which has just published a book on anti-Semitism called On Anti-Semitism, Solidarity and the Struggle for Justice. Now, JVP, in case you don't know, is a grassroots Jewish organization in the United States that promotes Palestinian rights and supports BDS. In fact, Omer Barghouti, a co-founder of the BDS movement, is a contributor to this book on anti-Semitism. So is Aurora. I've just reviewed the book for Political Quarterly, and my review opens with her essay, Who Am I to Speak?, the most powerful in the collection. Aurora recalls a piece of family history. My father's family, she writes, lived in a small southern Ukrainian village where each spring the Easter sermons sent their neighbors rampaging against the Jewish farmers and craftspeople who lived among them. There was, she says, a three-cornered argument among the Jews in the village about what, if anything, would, in her words, save the Jews. And I quote, the Orthodox said it was in God's hands. The Zionists said only Jews could be counted on to stand by Jews, and we needed a defensible territory of our own where we call the shots. The communists and socialists and anarchists said only an alliance of all the working people can dismantle our oppression and everyone else's. Now, the small southern Ukrainian shtetl or village from which Aurora's father's family came is, so to speak, the same shtetl from which the families of most Ashkenazi European Jews came, including my family, and the same three-cornered argument went on in the shtetls of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, Orthodox versus Zionist versus anti-nationalist left. Actually, there were more than three corners to the argument. Moreover, some of the Orthodox were Zionist, and most of the Zionists were socialist and even Marxist. So the debate over the Jewish future was complex, but the point is that this is the Ur scene. This is my main point. This is the original and authentic setting for Zionism. Not a debate about how to make Great Britain greater or the mother country richer, but an argument about how to save the Jews. How, in other words, Jews could put an end to centuries of exclusion and persecution in Europe, how to secure a place in the sun. This is the piece that is missing from the stock discourse that folds Zionism completely, without remainder, into the history of European imperialism and colonialism. The missing piece is the centerpiece of the story. But it is certainly not the whole story, for Zionism is indeed implicated in more ways than one in the history of European imperialism and colonialism, and the State of Israel, though located in the East, has situated itself firmly in the West, as if it were a European implant. The whole story is a broken story, a story with two halves that do not fit together. And that's, I think, what complicates understanding. Look at it this way. Like the Roman god Janus, Zionism has two faces which look in opposite directions at once. That is to say, it belongs to two opposite histories at one and the same time. On the one hand, Zionism is part of the history of the Jews, a racialized minority, the internal other of Europe. On the other side, it is part of the story of British imperialism, specifically in the Middle East. On the one side, it was the exodus from Europe of a persecuted people. On the other side, it was itself part of European expansion into non-European lands. It is true that from the outset, starting with Theodor Herzl's address to the First Zionist Congress in 1897, Zionism spoke the language of colonization, but it was colonization for the sake of emancipation. That's how they thought of it, not to expand or enrich an empire. Seen from one side, Zionism was a flight from Europe, a movement that saw itself as the return of an exiled people to an ancient homeland, not as an extension of a European motherland. It saw itself that way whether you or I accept the narrative of return or not, and I most certainly do not. But seen from the other side, the Arab side, as it were, the Jews who came as settlers and established the state were Europeans by any other name, and they were. They were both. They were Jewish as distinct from European, and they were European as distinct from Arab. As the Palestinian academic Rafe Zreich puts it in a recent article, I quote him, "The Europeans see the back of the Jewish refugee fleeing for his life. The Palestinian sees the face of the settler colonialist taking over his land. One movement, two faces." So yes, Zionism is part of the history of European imperialism in the 20th century, and it was a settler project. However, the plight of millions of marginalized European Jews in the first half of the century, together with their hopes and aspirations for a better life, are one thing. The imperial ambitions of European powers that set out to colonize the globe in order to extend the scope of their rule, plunder resources, and create captive markets for their products are another. When the left gives the impression that this subtle difference eludes them, when they fold Zionism too caught into the story of European hegemony, then they have erased from the record the argument that went on in the shtetls of Europe over the way out for Jews from oppression, which is the backstory for Zionism. When they erase this backstory, is it any wonder if a ripple of discomfort spreads among the rank and file of Jews, including many of us who repudiate Zionism, condemn the occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza, and denounce the oppression of Palestinians by the State of Israel? You don't have to love Israel to feel this discomfort. It's a short step from feeling this discomfort to sensing anti-Semitism, even if that perception is false, especially when phrases like the power of the Israel lobby or the influence of the Zionist media are loosely bandied about, conjuring up ghosts of a ghastly past, rubbing new salt into old wounds. To quote the late anti-Zionist socialist Jew Steve Cohen, any group which claims to be against anti-Semitism should be ultra-vigilant in the imagery it evokes. The same rule of thumb applies to all forms of racism. It's a fundamental principle of anti-racist action, which does not mean pulling your punches. Nothing I have said is intended to suggest that anyone should go soft in arguing against Zionism as an idea or Israel as a state. I certainly do not intend to tone down my criticism. One last paragraph?
Yes.
Which brings me back, in closing, to Aurora, whose name, of course, means dawn. Here is how Aurora introduces herself at the beginning of her essay, Who Am I to Speak?, in the book on anti-Semitism. Quote, "A colonial subject, a woman of color, an immigrant, disabled, and chronically ill, of mixed class, and a Jew." Now, she's no Zionist, nor was her father's family in that southern Ukrainian shtetl where Jews argued furiously about which road to take to get out of their predicament, out of a 1,000-year nightmare that seemed never-ending. In the book, Aurora is described as, and I quote, "a sixth-generation radical." "I believe our safety lies in the solidarity of working people," she writes, "and not in a Zionist state." For daring to say this, she has paid a price. "I have been accused," she says, "of betraying the Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis. I have been accused of being a retroactive Nazi collaborator by people who claim that dead children also accuse me." Now, since several members of her extended family, including children, died at the hands of the Nazis on a single day in May 1942, this accusation cuts deep, but not deep enough to damage her vision. She sees, accurately in my view, the hand of Europe at the back of the mess that we call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, along with other messes in the wider world. The oppression of Jews, imperialist manipulation, and profound racism have all enmeshed to create this nightmare. I'm quoting her. And I want all my peoples to be free of it. Who am I to speak? That's the title of her essay, and the answer, I think, is contained in the author. She is a one-woman rainbow coalition with a voice as broad and as inclusive as humanity itself. When I speak out for the humanity of Palestine, she writes at the end of her essay, I am defending the humanity of everyone, including all Jews. Let Aurora have the last word, or rather, let the last word be Aurora. Thank you for listening.
Right, thank you so much, Brian, for giving us so much rich food for thought. And the next speaker will be John Rose. Many of you will know him as a long-standing member of Socialist Worker. He's written many of the pamphlets that we still read on Israel and Palestine and resistance, and also The Myths of Zionism, this book also available at Bookmarks. John's going to speak for 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. And I want to begin by telling a little bit more about Brian before I try to respond to one or two of the points that he made. 10 years ago, Tom Hickey, who's in the room, and myself and several others, including Jonathan Rosenhead, who's also in the room, had a meeting before this one, took the argument about the academic boycott into our union, the University College and Lecturers Union. And there was a most ferocious fight with the Zionists, had their own organisation called Engage. It was a really bitter fight, so bitter that it made the front page of the Jewish Chronicle week in, week out. I think it was the summer of 2008. And it got so vicious and so publicised that Tony Blair, it must have been earlier because Blair was still Prime Minister, phoned up the Israeli Prime Minister to apologise for our union. Brian, who disagreed with us about the boycott, nevertheless stood by us throughout because he thoroughly resented the way the Zionists attacked us for being anti-Semitic. So I want to make that point at the beginning and to really underline it, because Brian's been a really great friend and indeed comrade to those of us who are anti-Zionist, and in many ways, to a degree, fit the kind of stereotype that Brian wants to try to dismantle. Now let me come on to that. I think there's a flaw in Brian's argument, sophisticated though it is. And given the amount of time I've got, I want to keep it as simple as possible. The whole question of Janus face, the whole question of two sides of Zionism. It's absolutely true, and we are often guilty of this, that we don't discuss thoroughly and properly the roots of Zionism. We don't discuss thoroughly and properly that it was perfectly feasible to be a Zionist, a Jewish Zionist and a Jewish socialist, even a Jewish revolutionary socialist, several generations ago at the beginning of the century. In fact, many of the original settlers who went to Palestine genuinely believed they were still revolutionary socialists, they were still communists. Many had come out of the 1905 Russian Revolution. So in their heads, what's in their heads fits very much the image that Brian has painted. The problem is, the moment they arrive on Palestinian soil, whatever in their heads, they do become colonial settlers. And there's no way around that. And some of them understood that. And there was two possible alternatives to becoming a colonial settler. One was to try to organise alongside Arab workers against, at that time it was the Ottoman Empire. And incidentally, it's just worth making the point that from the very beginning, whatever the intentions of individual Zionist settlers, the project required an imperial power. They even tried it with the Russian Tsar. They certainly tried it on with the Ottomans. And of course, it was the good old British Empire that finally provided the sort of so-called legalistic space for the Jewish settlements. But this is the difficulty. That once you've arrived, you are becoming a settler, and you count a tiny number try to work alongside Arab workers to resist the imperial rule, whether it was the Ottomans or the British. A larger number turned around and came out because they realised what was at stake. But of course, a majority stayed. And generation after generation, because understandably the fighting was so bitter, it was quite easy to forget those roots. I think this is the difficulty in Brian's argument. But I think there's something that there is a slightly different lesson which I want to draw, which Brian really didn't have time to draw out, which I think the point that Brian does make, which I think we can find some sympathy for, is how we argue the point. It's not a question of principle. I reject the two sides of Zionism. There aren't two sides of Zionism in the 21st century. It's very much a one-sided affair. I mean, as a matter of fact, there's an important number of, and it's only a minority sadly, there's a minority of Israelis who can't stand the one dimension that Zionism has become. I mean, the horror stories of racism, which they tell on a daily basis, are absolutely appalling. Lots of people in the room will have heard it. But nevertheless, it does matter how you make the argument. We're not talking here about hardline Zionist cadre. That's not what we're talking about. What interests me, and I'm going to kind of sum up on this point, what interests me is how members of the Socialist Workers' Party, and particularly our student supporters, argue with supporters of the Union of Jewish Students on the campuses. I want us to focus on that discussion. In other words, and I was one of them, and Rob Ferguson was another, and there's several more in this room. We're all, once upon a time, those of us who are Jewish and who became revolutionary socialists and anti-Zionists, most of us were committed Zionists. I certainly was. As a matter of fact, it was 50 years ago during the June War that I began to change my mind when I heard arguments about Israel and Palestine I'd never heard before. I was confronted by two types of socialists. One who was tub-thumping, calling Israel all sorts of names, by extension calling me all sorts of names, and of course I wasn't going to listen to that. That did sound like anti-Semitism, even if it wasn't. But there's another type of socialist who argued with me, who took me seriously, took my Zionist views seriously, but sat down and argued and argued and argued. As a matter of fact, I had the good fortune to be at the London School of Economics at the time of the June War, and it was 6 days. It was 6 days of teaching at the LSE 50 years ago in 1967. And so that was quite a long time to begin to change your mind. And I did begin to change my mind. Not straight away, you kind of hang on to it. Because it does run deep. It's absolutely true. The commitment does run deep. So you hear the arguments worry you. And the arguments sit uncomfortably with the views that you've been brought up with. And you battle it out in your own head. But the more you find out, the more I found out about the plight of the Palestinians, the more I began to realize the connection between what was essentially an imperial colonial project and Zionism and what had happened to the Palestinians, the stronger my overturning in my head of those Zionist ideas became. I think that argument, that principle remains true today. So I want us to think about how we make the argument with those young Jewish students. In many cases, we're not going to win that argument, but incidentally, it matters a great deal that we do make friends with Jewish students on campuses, because, as a matter of fact, anti-Semitism isn't the main form of racism at the moment. Far from it. The main form of racism everywhere, including on the campuses, is Islamophobia. And there's a very good chance of winning at least a minority of Jewish students, even if they support Israel, to campaign against Islamophobia. And that's going to be quite contradictory, isn't it? But that's how life is. Life is very contradictory if people are in the process of moving from one position to another. It might take some time. So we continue the argument. We stand together with, sometimes, as a matter of fact, it would be excellent if the Union of Jewish Students, which is openly, explicitly Zionist, unambiguously Zionist, nevertheless, if the Union of Jewish Students brings a contingent onto an anti-racist demonstration, what are we going to say? Go away, no, you can't come. On the contrary, we say, welcome the Union of Jewish Students onto that demonstration, and then we're going to immerse ourselves amongst them and start an argument, quietly, about Israel and racism, and trying to point out those contradictions. How am I doing on time, Chair?
2 minutes.
I don't really want to take any more time, actually. I think I've made the points I want to make. I'm going to hand over to Rob.
Thank you, John. The next speaker is Rob Ferguson, who is also from Newham SWP and Stand Up to Racism. He has been, on a national level, a campaigner on Islamophobia and a major contributor to the pamphlet on Prevent, and has written, as has been suggested by the two speakers, there is anti-Semitism on the right in Europe, and there is a good article in this ISJ about that. Rob.
Right. I mean, first of all, I do just want to say a word about why I'm really pleased that John and I are speaking to this very full meeting this evening with Brian. People might not be aware, but Brian has made an important contribution to this whole discussion and debate, furious debate, around anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. His article in 2004 in The Nation, The Myth of the New Anti-Semitism, still serves today as a benchmark that's referred to in terms of the argument now. And there's a paper he wrote in 2014 that he presented to Berlin, which I think is one of the most sensitive and discussions about the other side of the coin is what do we mean by anti-Semitism? Not denying what they say, but what do we mean by it? The other thing I have to say is that if you read anything by Brian, it has a clarity and an accessibility that unfortunately is not a general rule in academia, and I'll recommend it on that basis. Okay, I was going to start by outlining some of our common ground, but Brian has done that at the beginning of his talk, I think, extremely clearly. And therefore I want to really address this area that we, all three of us, are discussing in terms of, as Brian put it, the Janus face of Zionism, and John has responded as well with his comments. I think I'd want to approach that discussion with a rather different formulation, although I think there's a strong correspondence in terms of our arguments that we share, that Brian and I and John share. See, the way I'd put it, and I think I have to be careful when we talk about Zionism as an ideology and Zionism as a movement. See, the way I'd put it is there was always a tension within Zionism as a movement for precisely the reasons that Brian has outlined. That as a movement, those who were drawn to it were indeed motivated to different degrees by those two elements. The colonial settler project on the one hand, and the response and reaction to anti-Semitism and the rise of fascism on the other. You can see this most clearly in the most famous example is probably the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where we saw left-wing Zionists, the socialist anti-Zionist Bund, and Communist Party members and others united in an armed insurrectionary battle against huge forces that they couldn't win against, but which inspired thousands then and generations since. But it's true not only of the Warsaw Ghetto Rising, it's true of left pole Zion during the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, where sections of the left pole Zion split and joined the Bolsheviks in the side of that civil war, and some of them indeed were absolutely at the forefront of fighting the anti-Semitic pogroms of the White Armies. Even closer to home, in London's East End, the young Pole Zion split from the Jewish Board of Deputies position and joined the Jewish People's Council Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism, led by the Communist Party, hated by the leadership of the Jewish Board. And there's other examples. This trajectory then is marked, of course, by the Holocaust. The Holocaust, which marked a historic defeat for the left on the one hand, the worst genocide in modern times on the other, accompanied by the shutters being brought down across the borders of state after state to which Jews could have otherwise fled. And when we look at, I want to then come to today, because if you look at Jewish opinion today, there's a poll, a recent poll, which I don't have much reason to doubt, actually, which says that 90% of British Jews express some affinity towards Israel. 60%, or just over, would describe themselves as Zionists. Now, what's the other question here? Do we explain this by saying that the driving force for the majority of them, I'm not talking about the hardcore Zionist supporters, the majority of them is an absolute aspiration to establish a colonial settler state in the Middle East and oppress the Palestinians? No, I don't believe it is. The legacy of that, the Holocaust, is still so great. It impacts on the families of young Jews today that actually it's the vacuum left after the Second World War we still live with now. And you see, that then opens something up, because that tension then that I've referred to, I believe, still exists there today. And what's most important about that, it exists at a time when we're seeing the return of forces once consigned to the margins of Nazi pond life, of anti-Semitic narrative and organizations that are back in sections of the political mainstream in Eastern Europe and even in the United States with the alt-right and so forth. And there was a reaction, both in the United States. So, for example, J Street, If Not Now, Jewish National Democratic Council, the Reform Movement, all not only denounced the appointment of the disgusting worm Steve Bannon as chief advisor to Trump, they attacked some of their own organizations, leading Zionist organizations, not least AIPAC, for welcoming Trump and his appointment. You saw the same here with the letter from 200 young Jews, many of them presidents of UJS, in some of them on the Jewish Board of Deputies and so on, describing the president of the British Board of Deputies a letter to congratulating Trump as beneath contempt and so forth. Now, does this then just make it a simple matter? No, I don't think it does. But what it means is, I think here the division, the way I'd see it, is, I think following on from a point John made, is the key division here is between the colonial settler state and the response to anti-Semitism, marked above all by the Jewish populations outside Israel. Okay, this is where it's key. I don't believe, I don't have time to go into it about how can you change the major swathe of opinion in Israel. Suffice to say, I don't believe you can. But outside Israel, I think it's a different matter. There, the question of racism, whether it be against Muslims or others, the rise of the right, the rise of fascist organizations, the rise of anti-Semitism across, whole parts of Europe, has a resonance in Britain too. It's not just us that look across the channel. Young Jews do too when they see Jobbik, the Front National, the Austrian Freedom Party, and all the rest. And this is where, to sum up, I believe we have to, in a sense, combine the two positions in a way that enables us, on the one hand, to defend the principle of anti-Zionism, support for the Palestinians. I mean, Brian and I Brian disagrees somewhat with John and I on this, but we would, defend BDS, but in such a way as to be not to allow that to prevent unity with any and every young Jew or old Jew who will stand side by side against racism and anti-Semitism. It's that understanding of the reason why the Zionist movement had a hold on sections of Jews and still does, the tensions of that hold. And I tell you what, you think the bloomin' Zionist narrative is just made to convert non-Jewish opinion, you should see the effort they pour into schools, universities, to make sure that Jews outside Israel identify with Israel, right from year dot all the way through. That you could see as some monolithic propaganda effort. He could also see it as a sign of weakness, a potential sign of weakness, a fracture, because they know that actually there is a difference. And that's something that we must always bear in mind when we try and build the unity against the real threat of the past that is emerging back into the present.
I want to address the question of one movement, two faces, which was a key phrase, I think, in Brian's contribution. And I don't want either to speak about, as Brian didn't either, about the clumsy references to the relationship between Zionists and Hitler that were made by Ken, who should, in my view, be defended, but also we should not fail to recognize that there was a very, very clumsy set of references. But in relation to what Brian wants to say, Zionism is a movement, one movement with two faces. I want to refer everybody to the two founding myths of Zionism. At least the first founding myth was this, that it's a land without a people for a people without a land. Of course, dismissing the existence of the Palestinians as if they were simply part of the environment to be disposed of in any way they like. The second myth, of course, was this, that Israel provides an oasis of civilization in a desert of despotism, which is actually a much more, it's a myth, but it's a more accurate statement of what lay behind the Zionist project, a project which was always, in one sense, certainly about, as Brian says, saving the Jews from threat in the view of Zionists, but an attempt to save Jews from such a threat through an alliance with various versions of imperialism, first with the British and then later with the Americans. So what are we to do then with that rhetoric today? What are we to do with the fact that we are told that those who question the right of Israel to exist are in some sense anti-Semitic? Well, let's be quite clear what we're being asked to say when we're asked, do you support the right of Israel to exist? What that means is, do you support the right of one ethnic group to establish a state in which they will have precedence over every other ethnic group and exclude from the privileges of that privileged group any others, including the people indigenously who occupied the land? Now, I think that does bestow upon us a kind of responsibility, while certainly recognizing, as Brian invites us to do, that there is a movement whose origin in part was about finding a mechanism to rescue the Jews, ends up being a movement which secures that rescue or attempts to do it. No one would actually describe Israel as a successful rescue effort, I hope, for Jews, but secures it only at the expense of displacing and dispersing the indigenous inhabitants of the land. Now, this isn't an abstruse academic discussion. This is a poignant discussion, and it's one that I think that we have to be very, very careful about. We do have
Could
to
you sum up, please?
We do have to recognize the origin of the popularization of Zionism as a result of the Nazi Holocaust against European Jews. We have to recognize that, but we cannot have the argument unless we simultaneously recognize that Zionism in and of itself, the establishment of the State of Israel, is about dispossessing another people, and then that's the core of why it's not simply an argument against the policies of the Israeli state, it's an argument against the very existence of Israel.
I should start by saying I agree with John Rose that it is important we should be sensitive in how we argue our case in the cases where Jews might be offended if we conduct it in a certain way. We should, for example, always refer to the Israel lobby and not the Jewish lobby. We need to be careful about the languages that we use and what we infer from it. Starting with Brian's case of Daphne, she was offended, she felt criticized, I was at a meeting which Brian addressed about a week ago, in which there were about 40 or 50 Jews in the room, left to liberal, and many of those felt uncomfortable in that sort of way, despite being very critical of Israel. So that is a fact that we live with. I used to feel offended like that. I started feeling offended in 1968 when my wife started criticizing Israel, and immediately afterwards, and I felt really uncomfortable, though I just assumed Israel would sort it out with the Palestinians. Now they're in such a strong position. And gradually, over the period of the following decades, I remained offended by people who seemed to be criticizing Israel more stringently than I yet felt able to. I don't feel that anymore. I feel that we passed the Rubicon quite some time ago, and that we are not obliged to be hypersensitive about people who are still feeling offended that Israel can be criticized in serious ways. Brian says we wouldn't treat other racial minorities so aggressively as we do with Israel, but we're not transgressing against the Jews when we criticize Israel. We're criticizing Israel as a nation. And the reason why we're aggressive about it is because Israel commits horrendous crimes and continues to do so over a period of some 50 years, if not more. And we perhaps get aggressive ourselves because there's a very aggressive Israel lobby, which is campaigning with apparently no feeling for sensitivity for anyone else's feeling, as if the Jews were entitled to absolute protection from anti-Semitism. I think the fact that some Jews are likely to be offended by criticism of Zionism is a reason for managing the way in which we do it, but there is no right to be offended as a veto against serious political critique and discussion. That's what Timothy Garton-Ash says in his book on free speech, which came out last year. And I think we need not to be intimidated and not to fail to make our political arguments strongly, but not in a way which is insensitive. Thank you.
My name is Volkert Mosler. I come from Frankfurt. I have to say this before because it's important, I think, in this issue here. My wife asked me to speak on this because her mother, she was born in Berlin in 1915 and in a Jewish family, and in 1933 she left for Amsterdam, and in 1935 the Zionists, she joined the Communist Youth Organization in 1933. And in 1935, he was helped by the Zionist organization to go to Israel, or to Palestine then, of course, yeah. And I met her in '69, and she was always critical about Israel. She always said, I don't like how we deal with the Palestinians, what you do to the Palestinians, but what can I do? Yeah, I would not have survived without the Zionist movement. That's what her answer. And I felt there is a problem here for the left, because the defeat of the working class in 1933 is really the problem of the whole thing. Because if not for this defeat, the whole question of Zionism wouldn't have arisen. So I think, as a German socialist now, to speak about that, we in Germany, for example, do not support the BDS campaign. Because if one Nazi would support it, we would be killed. This would kill us, yeah? So, and I defend the BDS campaign, but not in Germany, because this is a completely different subject. Because we would be accused to be on don't buy, kauft nicht bei Juden. We would be accused to defend this, which would be wrong, but we couldn't explain it to the general people. So we don't support this campaign. But this doesn't mean that it is anti-Semitic, this campaign. I don't want to say this. So in Germany, this is a special case. I would say the 400,000 people, Jewish people, who went to Palestine in the time between 33 and 47, when all the doors were closed, as the speaker said before, all the other doors were closed, went to Palestine, under the flag of Zionism. I think we have to defend that. We have to say they didn't have a chance. There was no working class movement to save them. The only force which saved them was the Zionist movement at the time. Therefore, I would say there was a Zionist movement which we have to apologize in a way for. We have to say there is a cause here which we just cannot ignore. The mother of my wife, she voted in '47 in a general not election, what you call it, referendum on which was then put to the Jewish people. What sort of state should it be? A binational state or a pure Jewish state? And there was 1/3 of the of the population which said we want a binational state. So there was a large minority at that time in the Jewish population who was not for a purely Zionistic idea. And I think, anyway, I think we have to defend that.
Thank you.
Comrade, I can't answer all the points you made, but I do think that you do have to take up the question of Palestine and Zionism in Germany. You can't duck it or evade it. And I just want to make a couple of other points. Maybe I'm a bit cruder. I haven't been involved in all these debates in the depth that other people have been. But my dad came over on the kinder transport. My grandparents were able to get out from Germany. My mother's side were Hackney Jews and Fort Mose and the rest of it. I've done probably hundreds of meetings on being Jewish and Zionism, and I've always started with Zionism as a reaction to the oppression of Jews. You cannot begin any other way. I've never seen anybody else on the left approach it in any other way. So we shouldn't set up straw men in that case. I think we should also be clear when we talk about Zionist emigration. Where did Zionism come from? Came from the Dreyfus case. Came from people escaping the pogroms in Russia initially. And you look at where people went. Hundreds went to Palestine. Tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands went everywhere else. Went to America, to Latin America, to Japan, to China, to Western Europe, and it was a minority view within the Jewish community. And what the Holocaust did was it effectively wiped out the Jewish socialist tradition. That's what died in the Holocaust, along with just the numbers. That political tradition died, and people are right that some Jews ended up in Palestine. Some of them ended up in Palestine because Britain wouldn't let them in, but they would let in Ukrainian Waffen-SS to work in the steelworks in Corbyn. That's the real anti-Semitism that's going on in this country. We should call it for what it is. In terms of your friend Daphne, I don't know if she was in Hackney North Labour Party. I don't know. You don't have to say. But I was in the pub 2 weeks ago with comrades from Hackney North Labour Party, and they were muttering. I said, you had a meeting, how was it? Great election result. We didn't talk about the election result. We talked about Livingston. We had a resolution on Livingston. You kind of go, well, what a waste was that? So maybe there was some frustration because of that, if it were that Labour Party. I just want to finish on this. I think the crucial argument today is with young Muslims, actually. It's not, okay, Jewish students, but it's with young Muslims who, because Israel claims to speak for all Jews, slip into the anti-Semitic arguments, and that's where I try and put my emphasis as a Jew, as an anti-imperialist. And I'm really, really grateful. We built a Stop the War movement in this country that said no to Islamophobia, and no to racism, right at the heart of it, because it gives us some tools to fight with, some bullets to fire.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you. I think someone did that.
I should possibly apologise before I put my foot in it, but I want to ask a question. I hope I understand the plight of Jews in Ukrainian villages, and I hope I understand that they had to make a choice between three political currents. But as I understand it, the leaders of Zionism also made a choice, and their choice that they were prepared to sacrifice ordinary Jews in pursuit of a political project, and were very cynical in doing so, knowing full well that the foundation of a homeland would not provide a solution for the majority of Jews. So the question I want to ask is, do ordinary Jews understand the foundations of the political project they purport to support? And is there any mileage at all in undermining or critiquing Zionism and where it came from and what it stands for?
Two short points. There's a survivor of the Holocaust. He's called Leslie Schwartz, and he spoke in Germany many, many times, especially for school children, for instance. And he also wrote a book about his experience. He was one of the survivors of the death train, and there was a film made of him. But he wrote in this book, in one short passage, he says he was in one of these camps after Hitler, and waiting, hoping to get out. And he got a letter from an uncle in the USA, and he went to the USA. Okay, he was lucky. But he was completely lucky because the whole package of letters were being destroyed by the Zionists so that they don't get letters from their families in the US or in Great Britain and so on and so forth. This is a historical fact. So masses of Jews were forced to go to Israel. There are many other examples. Moroccan Jews, 250,000 Moroccan Jews, forced to go to Israel. Then the second thing I want to say quite quickly is I'm also Jewish. My father lost many family members. He never talked about it. I don't know how many he lost, but it was a lot. And there is an active BDS group in Germany. I live in Germany. I think as socialists we should support the BDS group. I don't agree in that point with my previous comrade. I think it's a big mistake. By being defensive, you don't gain anything.
I know the points Brian is making has to do with the origins of Zionism and the debates that took place mainly in Eastern Europe. But let me give a different perspective on this. I was born and brought up and live in Turkey. I'm Jewish. Tiny Jewish community, about 15,000 people in a total population of 80 million Muslims. Now, I think it was Rob who said 60% of British Jews consider themselves to be Zionists. No such statistic exists for Turkey, but I can assure you it's 100%. The reason is, if you're a Turkish Jew, you've been through a history of, not pogroms, state-orchestrated special taxes on religious minorities, mainly Jews, one particular pogrom in a particular town, a whole variety of disastrous events. You've been through all of that. You're scared anyway because, if you're not a socialist, you're not a sociologist, you think, what the hell am I doing in a country with 80 million Muslims, with an Islamic, in quotation mark, government elected? The Jewish community in Turkey is scared. For them, Israel is a place they will run to next time something goes wrong in Turkey. Therefore, they're all Zionists. It's not a particularly political thing. It's just a safe haven. Now, therefore, we do need, I feel sympathy for your argument about, actually, for most Jews, and I'm sure this was the case in Eastern Europe, Zionism is not a political project. It was, what do we do? How the hell do we get away from racism and anti-Semitism and all that? On the other hand, what makes me feel less sympathy is that even in God-forsaken Turkey, Jews have managed to call me a self-hater. I get reports because my mother, of course, is part of the Jewish community. I'm not. But she always hears the chief rabbi, whenever my name comes up, saying, "Why have you been talking to him? He's our enemy. He's against Israel." So that stops me from having any kind of sympathy, quite apart from the politics, for Zionists. But I can understand why one would be a Zionist.
So much. Thank you.
Hi, I would like to speak about the racism, and some people might call it anti-Semitism, within Israel by Jews against the Mizrahi Jews. The Mizrahim are the Jews from the Arab countries or the Eastern world that are right now being, I think, oppressed and stereotyped by the Jews from the Western world and Eastern Europe, which they're stereotyped as being, like the Arab stereotype of being like stupid and short-sighted, and I think that's they're sort of overlooked in the Zionist stream from the Western world. And yeah, just wanted to say that.
Hi, Catherine Johnson, Hackney. I have a great deal of sympathy with the guy who's said, I hope I don't put my foot in my mouth. I've recently tried to engage more with this debate, and I welcome these discussions and also the establishment of an organisation called Free Speech on Israel, because I think many people are afraid of saying anything in the debate, and the consequences of saying the wrong thing are enormous. And as you know, in the Labour Party, you can be removed from any activity. As part of trying to engage more with this debate, I attended the Hackney Holocaust Memorial service this year. And that, to me, seemed to open up a way in which perhaps looking at the whole of history could help us all stand side by side in fighting racism and discrimination. So, and this is not to take anything away from the industrial scale and systematic methods of the Holocaust, but one of the Orthodox Jewish speakers at the Holocaust Memorial Service spoke about the 6 million Jews who had died, and then talked about the hundreds of thousands of other people who had died in the Second World War. Now, given that, depending on whether you include the people who died of famine, somewhere between 50 and 72 million people died in the Second World War, the left has an enormous job to do on reclaiming history and looking at the solidarity across peoples and building that working class solidarity and our knowledge of history so that we can stand side by side.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kate. I'm from Leeds SWP. I'm a Jewish member of the SWP. I wanted to come back really to something that John Rose said, because I guess that I was brought up what could be called a vague Zionist. My father and grandmother escaped Nazi Romania, and the reason in our house people supported the State of Israel was not because they were apolitical, as some people argued earlier on. I don't agree that it's not a political position. It was an extremely pessimistic position. It was a position that said you can't actually fight anti-Semitism. And that was a direct result of what had happened in the Holocaust. Now, I agree with John that I think that with the rise of fascists across Europe and with the rise of the right, there is an absolute link between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And frankly, we do have to have an argument with people who are not hardline Zionists. The students on the universities are not the State of Israel. I'm guessing that people who want to fight anti-Semitism are not getting very much, actually, from the UJS. When I was a student, which is quite a long time ago, I was asked to join a Jewish society at York University. And I asked, was it just, what was it? And they were like, it's nothing, you don't have to come to anything, just show solidarity. It's like, that's fine. And we got joined up to the Union of Jewish Students, and I got some stuff through the post, which I frankly thought was from Nazis. It said, you are a Jew and you are different. You cannot ever feel anything but different from the society you are in, and you might as well accept it. Now, if that is what is still being argued at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, actually, we have a political argument about how you fight racism. You don't fight racism by saying you set up a racist state, a colonial racist state that oppresses another people. I think John's absolutely right. That's not the first thought of people who say they support Israel. The first thought is there's a rise in anti-Semitism and we can't do anything about it. Our job as socialists is actually to argue that side by side we can stand together, that the anti-Semitism, when Katie Vile-Hopkins talks about a final solution for Muslims, and that sort of language is seen as acceptable in the likes of the Daily Mail, we should fucking well have something political to say about this. Years after the Holocaust, as a child when I was frightened, I have small Muslim kids in my school who are frightened. We should be standing side by side. As socialists, we have an argument that says we have a way of fighting racism. That includes anti-Semitism. If we approach Jewish students on campuses as if they're hardline Zionists and the enemy, we are going to have real problems. We need to be standing side by side against the fascists, and some of those will join us, hopefully.
Yes, I think I want to come quickly back to what Ken Livingstone said. I'm against the Labour Party witch hunt. I'm against him being suspended. They haven't actually, I think, charged him with anti-Semitism, but they've suspended him for another year or two or something. And I'm against if they try and expel him. What he said didn't help himself. It was unhelpful what he said, and it was clumsy. And likening Zionists in the 1930s to Hitler, no. I mean, he made a very loose comparison. I mean, the Zionists who did want to go, they wanted to escape because they wanted to go and thrive elsewhere, whereas for a few years Hitler wanted Jews to leave and get out of the way before he later decided to exterminate Jews across Europe. I think the problem is, I think maybe the roots of can't speak for Ken Livingstone. I think the roots of this issue is when you only look at Zionism as a racist colonial settler project, which of course it is all them things. It is dead racist. I want to see an end to the state of Israel as it exists. I want one state, equal rights for Arabs and Jews living together. But the roots of Zionism, as has been said, is a pessimistic reaction to anti-Semitism. You can't just look at it in terms of it being racist and colonialist against Palestinians, even though it absolutely is that. The people who have support for Israel amongst a section of Jewish people, not all of them are hardcore Zionists. I expect most of them aren't, but they think just in case, somewhere just in case. And that's because of the Holocaust. That's not because of... you've got to explain it like that. You can't say it's something they're inherently predisposed to supporting Israel. It's in their cultural makeup. No. And I think we have to absolutely expose the crimes of Israel, expose the racism, but also to undercut the appeal of Zionism, we have to absolutely show that we're against anti-Semitism, wherever it stands. I mean, some of the Facebook shite I see banging on about George Soros. Aye, where are you going with this? Just very quickly, 2 years ago, there were a small group of Nazis who were going to demonstrate in Golders Green. They didn't. But I think the campaign against anti-Semitism, there was another organisation who wanted to organise separately from UAF. And there was talk on this Facebook of bringing some Israeli flags. Now, I don't know how hardcore these people were in terms of Zionism. But if that demonstration had gone ahead, if Nazis had gone there, it might have been the case that we might have had to link arms with some people who were holding Israeli flags 10 minutes earlier. What do? You link arms against the Nazis. If this does happen in future, and you have an argument about the state of Israel, but you need to prove you're against anti-Semitism. You can't just say, F off, I don't agree with you on this. We have to unite on the area we do agree on, while being against all forms of racism, whether it be anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or anything else.
Thank you, Comrade.
Yeah, I want to follow on from that, because I think we've got to be absolutely clear. Our starting point is not opposition to Zionism, it's opposition to anti-Semitism. And when it comes down to the question of convincing Jewish students, I'll tell you what we need to be clear about. Our record as part of the revolutionary socialist movement in opposing anti-Semitism is superior, infinitely superior to the record of the Zionists. And we've got to be clear about that. The Bolsheviks were absolutely 100% opposed to anti-Semitism. They recruited the best fighters amongst the Jewish population in Russia because of that. They were able to undermine the ability of the Zionists, the emerging Zionist movement, to actually get a hearing amongst the Jewish population precisely because of that. And if you look at the 20th century, the fighters against anti-Semitism were the left. This meeting's about the left and anti-Semitism. And I think we shouldn't in any shape, way or form be at all embarrassed about our history and tradition. The way we have won many, many Jewish people to our organisation and our tradition is because we are the ones who fight hardest against anti-Semitism. And to go back to what Julie said, absolutely. If somebody comes to attack somebody, a Jew, who supports Israel, I will stand with them 100% against the anti-Semite. But I will argue with them about the state of Israel. But we need to convince them in practice that we are the people who fight hardest. And you know what? We should actually gen up and make sure we understand the history of Israel. It has not been a state which has actually fought consistently against anti-Semitism. Israel invited a man called John Vorster to come to Israel on a state visit. He was the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time. He laid a wreath at the Holocaust Memorial. People should know this. John Vorster, was interned by the British during the Second World War because he was a member of a pro-Nazi organisation. The Zionists have got nothing to teach our tradition about fighting anti-Semitism. We have got a lot to say about our tradition to Jewish workers, to Jewish students, that actually if you're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, you want to be part of an organisation and tradition that doesn't start with a position which Zionism accepts that anti-Semitism is permanent and eternal.
Can you sum up, please?
We don't accept that. We believe that anti-Semitism can be destroyed, but it can only be destroyed in the unity of Jewish and non-Jewish people coming together to fight it, not by separation.
Okay. Talat will be the last contributor. I'm sorry to all those people who put up your hand, but there just hasn't been time because we need the three speakers to come back. Thank you.
The debate, I think, about the question of BDS, particularly in Germany, and the difference of opinions that we've heard from the two comrades, I think really illustrates the deep complexities and tensions about this debate, which is why, for us on the left, to get it absolutely right is totally critical. That's the reason why, to echo a previous speaker, in terms of Livingston, it was a very foolish statement to make. I've been in the SWP for 33 and a half years, and I have never and would never speak about Nazism and Zionism in the same breath, because they are not the same thing. And I think that sadly, in some sections of the left, there has been a slippage for good reasons, not necessarily because they're all anti-Semites or whatever, but because they feel such a close identification and a very passionate way that they feel about Palestine, there can end up being a slippage about the kind of clumsy language and formulations that are made. And I think that for us, certainly within our tradition of the SWP, we do have to take people up on that. I'll give you another example. In Scotland, I come from Edinburgh. This year, on the Stand Up to Anti-Racism demonstration on March the 18th, the Friends of Israel turned up, just a tiny contingent of them, with the Israeli flag. When I was first told that they were there, my response was, good. And the reason I thought it was good is because, I wasn't naive. I thought to myself, I'm sure there are sections of them that are doing it because they want to be provocative towards us. But on the other hand, it was also an understanding that the Friends of Israel are not a totally homogenous organisation. Yes, there will be some hard nutters in there who will be very, very hardened Zionists, who will not like the left in any shape or form whatsoever, and are completely at ease about the dispossession of the Palestinians. But there will also be lots of other Jewish people who have, for whatever reason, a confused cultural association and understanding that somehow you've got to identify with the state of Israel, but they will also want to fight against racism. And, as far as I'm concerned, I think, and I'm also of a generation that can remember where hardline Zionists on university campuses in the early 80s did silence the debate over the question of Israel. But I think that for the first time since those decades, we've perhaps got an opportunity where we are able to relate to some Jewish students who may be attracted by all sorts of soft Zionist ideas, but that's the whole point, is that they will be quite soft on that issue, and we have the ability to pull them towards a hardened anti-racist position on everything, including having a discussion with them about Palestine. The thing about that anti-racist demonstration on March the 18th was that there were some sections on the left that demanded that we should have thrown the Friends of Israel off the demonstration. There were also others who were saying that subsequently we should ensure that they never turn up on the demonstration again, and if they do, we should take away the Israeli flags. That is not, in my view, the correct tactic to use on a demonstration like that. I think it's far better to welcome them on the demonstration, to talk about this being against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and also to then have comradely discussion with them about the question of Palestine.
Thank you for that discussion, comrades. Rob is going to have 5 minutes to sum up, as will the other speakers.
Mike Simons stressed the point about the central importance of maintaining the critique of Zionism right at the fore. And I absolutely agree with that. That cannot be diluted or dispensed with. Sometimes, depending on the context of the argument, if it's a question of anti-Semitism and so forth, it might not be the first point of the argument, but it should always be there, behind. It should shape and frame, in a sense, how we respond. I want to give a personal example. My father was born in Glasgow, of parents who fled the Pale. He went to Palestine with his brothers in the 1930s, before the Holocaust, and he joined the Haganah, the Zionist fighting organisation aimed at enforcing the boycott of Arab labour and expelling them from land and so forth. He saw himself as a socialist Zionist, and his experience there confronted him with a choice. Was he going to shed the socialist or the Zionist? He made the choice to shed the Zionist. He never went back to Israel. He supported the Palestinians in their struggle, and he did not support Israel either in 67 or in 73, 74. Now, that was a minority position. To be honest, I'm not sure what his position might have been after the Holocaust. He made that break before it. But the break element is critical, because there are clearly including on the campuses, those who are not going to never make a break, any more than those who defended South African apartheid were never going to make a break. But not every Jew on the campus can be compared to those who defended South African apartheid. I'd just put it like this. We wouldn't even be having this discussion, would we? We wouldn't be having a discussion with someone who was a defender of South African apartheid back in the 70s and 80s, because the question of whether they were anti-racist or not wouldn't arise. But it does arise with whole sections of Jewish population, of Jews and so on. And again, it's not about numbers. It's not even necessarily about the argument with an individual Jewish student. It's about the politics of the whole thing that lies behind it, whether you're talking to a Jewish student or not. It's about the question of how we forge unity against the main enemy. And there, I think, Mike's other point, in conclusion, about Islamophobia is absolutely right. Islamophobia is the vehicle for the rise of the forces of the right and fascism across Europe and beyond. And here Zionism distorts the argument, because the Zionists themselves Zionism itself can lead to oppression trumping. Benny Morris, who played a key role in exposing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, when confronted at the end, said, "I will prefer ethnic cleansing to genocide." Now, we have no truck whatsoever with this kind of league table of oppression. And I think it's my stress on unity cuts every way, in my view. It cuts with a Jewish student who will listen to you over your critique of Zionism, and that has to be there. You can't hide it, you can't put it away. While you're taking your stand on anti-Semitism, it's still there. It also cuts when faced with young Muslim students who are faced on the one hand with the terror attacks, acid attacks, anti-Muslim hate and so forth, and on the other hand identifying quite understandably with the victims of colonial settler oppression in Israel. And that can sometimes lead to a different kind of league table of oppressions. We have to cut through that, and sometimes it's not about picking an argument over the way someone shaped an argument. It's about putting the alternative instead. Why get entrenched always in the way someone's framed it? We have to put that alternative argument that can pull people away from perspectives and politics and framing things that don't take the struggle forward.
I want to make 2 points. A very small point about BDS in Germany. I disagreed with Volkert Mosler. I've got tremendous respect for him, but I think he's got the wrong position. I think there's a simple solution. There is a BDS movement in Israel. I would suggest the German comrades invite Israelis who support BDS to Germany, because that will cut through all the nonsense and also expose the fact that Israel itself is fractured. Even if the fraction that's very progressive is tiny, they are very, very important representatives in a sense of the wider Palestinian position. But there's a wider question at stake, which I think we need to flush out a little bit more. Why are we having this debate? There are 2 reasons why we're having this debate. One is the success of the BDS campaign and the determination of the Israeli government to fight back. There's absolutely no doubt that with the arrival of Mark Regev at the Israeli embassy, this is to put backbone into the official leadership of the Jewish community, to make it to have a tougher stand against the anti-Zionist movement and BDS. That's one factor, but I think there's a more important factor from our point of view. And it's expressed by a fantastic figure that I heard, a number, 200,000 people turned out for Jeremy Corbyn at the Durham Miners' Gala today. Now that's absolutely extraordinary. This movement for Jeremy Corbyn continues to rise. Unfortunately, we all know Jeremy's decided, because of the pressure from the Labour right, to put the question of Palestine on the back burner. And he'll go through kind of a diplomatic whirligig almost whenever he comes up under this, because he doesn't want to discuss this at the moment. We need to find a way of giving Jeremy Corbyn strength to tell what he really believes about Palestine. And that means actually escalating the battle in the Labour Party. And why this debate matters, it matters that although we're not in the Labour Party, we can help provide better arguments than have been used by some of the people who support Palestine inside the Labour Party. That's why this debate matters. And there's a serious possibility of beginning to turn it around. There's a thing called the Jewish Labour Movement. It's completely artificial, but it's been the vehicle for pro-Zionist voice inside the Labour Party, and so far they've been quite successful. Jonathan Rosenhead, who spoke second, is a member of the Hackney Labour Party, and he's helping to found something called Jewish Voice for Labour. And that's deliberately an attempt to provide an alternative Jewish poll which will simultaneously demonstrate it's possible to be thoroughly Jewish, secular or religious, and support Palestine. This is a new movement. We need to give that movement the best possible ideological arguments, tough arguments, hard arguments, but super sensitive arguments.
Now, are we going to have this rigmarole again?
Oh, go on.
Is that right? Am I audible? Right. I have just been attacked by a microphone. Okay, I'll hold it like this. Yes, thank you. I said at the beginning that I had a feeling this microphone was anti-Semitic, but anyway. It's very good of you to give me the last word, having given me the first word, and having given me more first words than other people. And so I don't want to take advantage of the privilege. I'm going to keep my remarks short. The main thing I want to say is this: how much I have appreciated the quality and thoughtfulness of the conversation here this evening. I mean, I came not knowing what to expect at all. And you'll have gathered from my opening remarks that I was a little concerned that I might be unable to connect at all with people in this room, and I was already looking at the exit to see if I would be able to escape in the case of an emergency. I also want to say that I appreciate very much the words that John and Rob said, and I didn't expect that either. It leads me to think that perhaps I should come here more often. Yes. I don't know how to select from amongst the points, so many good points that have been made, challenging points to my argument that I would very much like to respond to, but it's not possible in the time. This is an open conversation, and I believe it's one that's going to continue and ought to continue. And that's why I accepted the invitation to come, because I believe in the conversation, and because I think it is needed, and I think there are some people who are already ahead of the game, but there are others perhaps who share the same political goals, but don't necessarily avoid what one of the last speakers called the slippage into a certain kind of language. And in that connection, I just want to take up a point, Jonathan, you made about offence. I'm not sure where you are about being offended. Right. I wrote a book called Offence, the Jewish Case, and in that little book, I made very much the point that you have to be prepared to take the most robust criticism if you enter into the political arena, and I wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone is dancing around carefully in case they tread on somebody else's sensitive digit. But I'm also concerned about the way this word offend has been extended to cover almost anything and everything, right, that constitutes a negative reaction to something that's said. In the story that I was telling about Daphne, I don't think I used that word because the point I was trying to emphasize there was injustice. She felt an injustice was being done. In my view, we should not only be offended by injustice, but we should not accept it, whatever form it takes, whether it has to do with a debate or whether it has to do with the actions of a state. Regarding that state, Tom made a point about the idea of Israel having a right to exist. Now, the reason why I was running through these pages during the last few minutes is because I have a very bad memory and I always forget my own arguments. But in this book, Being Jewish and Doing Justice, I have a chapter on the idea that Israel has a right to exist, and I wanted to remind myself of what I said about that, which essentially is this, that no state has a right to exist, none. It's not a question about Israel or any other. This state doesn't have a right to exist. I mean, the United Kingdom might or might not split up. And if it does, so be it. And then it might come together again. Look what happened to Czechoslovakia. Look what happened to Yugoslavia. The whole idea of a right to exist is, in my view, a misconception when it comes to states. It's people who have a right to exist. Individuals have a right to exist. It's called the right to life. I think that what's happened in the case of Israel is that because of the backdrop, the backstory of the Shoah, of the Nazi Holocaust, insofar it was aimed at Jews, because 2/3 of Jews in Europe actually did lose their lives, the idea of a right to exist as such and also as a Jew became so, if you like, large, loomed so large, that it's got projected onto the state. There is so much in this that needs to be undone. And the way to undo it, in my view, is to engage, as a number of people have said, in argument with people who are perhaps following a false prophet or a false god. And that takes trouble and takes time. Merely denouncing the identity of Zionism doesn't help. As Jacqueline Rose says in her book, The Question of Zion, if you insult an identity, you tend to simply dig it in deeper. John and I have discussed this, and I want to say again, as I've said to John, that doesn't mean the identity shouldn't be challenged, critiqued. There's a difference between critiquing and insulting. And that is not just a matter of offending. That's as I see it anyway. It's not a matter of not offending. It's a matter, rather, I think, of engaging people on substantive issues. I think I'd better leave it there, mainly because I need a drink, and if I do, I imagine many other people in this room do as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry, comrades.